You're not in agreement with those who want to minimize the tragedy and brutality of slavery, but you also want to keep the school names. If a school is named after a slave owner, you're also okay with that because it will remind us and we will learn from it. Am I understanding that correctly?
For decades, Dr. Phil built a reputation around one simple idea: challenge people's excuses and force them to confront uncomfortable truths. His signature style was direct, confident, and designed to expose weak arguments. But when that same level of scrutiny was directed toward him, the dynamic looked very different. During a recent political discussion, he spoke at length about cultural decline, ideological influence, and what he described as growing threats to American values. The language sounded decisive, yet one thing stood out. The criticism remained broad, pointing toward unnamed groups and undefined institutions rather than specific examples that viewers could examine for themselves. That became the turning point of the conversation. Instead of debating abstract claims, the discussion shifted toward a much simpler standard. If the problem is real, can it be identified with concrete evidence? Once that challenge appeared, the confident certainty that had driven the earlier remarks became noticeably harder to maintain. The contrast was striking because it echoed the very philosophy that made Dr. Phil famous. Throughout his career, he encouraged people to move beyond generalizations and confront reality with facts. Applying that same expectation to his own arguments revealed an uncomfortable inconsistency between the message and the method. Yet the interview itself was only part of the story. Away from the cameras, another issue was unfolding that raised even more serious questions about credibility. While presenting himself as a voice of accountability and integrity, major developments surrounding his own media business were beginning to cast doubt on that image. Those events would soon become impossible to separate from the broader conversation about responsibility, leadership, and public trust.
I saw you as a guy who delved into political issues per se. You seem more willing, interested, and I must say, maybe more conservative than I thought you were. Is that a fair assessment?
Not at all.
Okay.
Because I am so not political, you can't even believe it. And I'll tell you why. I know nothing about politics. And I know why you say that. It sounds like it.
Right.
I talk about these things as cultural issues from a psychological, psychosocial standpoint, how they affect families and people. And they do overlap with some of the things that politicians talk about, but they talk about it from a political standpoint, funding standpoint, how they can get this bill or that bill through. Couldn't care less. But I am interested in those issues in terms of how they impact families in their day-to-day pursuit of life and peace and being able to raise their family in a healthy environment. So there's a lot of overlap, but I don't talk about it from a political standpoint because I frankly don't know enough about the politics of it all.
I'm
just willing to admit that. I'm just willing to admit it. I don't think a lot of other people know either. I'm just willing to admit it. People that are just trying to change some of the core values in America, core values of family, trying to rewrite history. And we've got people that are coming in saying, well, we want to change history, we want to change what kids are being taught in history, we want to change biology, we want to change all of the things that we have for 100 years had empirical data to support.
But tell me more. I don't want to gloss over this. I really want to understand this. Changing history. Okay, what was the history that used to be taught that now has been changed by the tyranny of the fringe?
Well, pick an area. We can talk about biology, where we have always had two sexes.
But what about history? Just to pick history, not biology, because you said history, biology. What about history?
Well, there's a lot of history to biology, and you would be missing a big point to pretend that there's not historical biology. But if you want to talk about history, we can, not in biology, but just talk about the history of mankind. Yeah. We've got areas where they don't want to talk about slavery. We had one a group of people that wanted to start describing slavery in history books as involuntary relocation. Right. This was not involuntary relocation. This was slavery. And we've got people that are wanting to rename schools because people that were doing what were the mores and folkways of the times now would clearly be doing things against the law, certainly against mores and folkways, because they were slave owners at the time, are saying, well, now we have to tear down these statues, we have to rename these schools, and we don't want to teach about them. We have to learn from our mistakes as a society. We can't pretend those things didn't happen. They did happen. They were dark and ugly times in American history. We don't want to pretend those things weren't there.
So let me see if I understand,
crazy.
because there's a bunch of stuff. So if I hear you correctly, you're not in agreement with those who want to minimize the tragedy and brutality of slavery, but you also want to keep the school names. If a school is named after a slave owner, you're also okay with that because it will remind us and we will learn from it. Am I understanding that correctly?
I think you're oversimplifying what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, if you're wanting to change American history to pretend that these people did not exist, and you want to measure them by today's yardstick rather than the yardstick at the time, that's what is referred to as presentism. And that's like saying, okay, you're going to drive through a neighborhood and the speed limit is 20. And you drive through that neighborhood doing 20, and then they come along and say, you know what, we're going to change the speed limit to 10, and we're going to give you a ticket for speeding when the speed limit was 20. It's now 10, but you weren't speeding when you were doing 20, but now it's 10. We're going to give you a retroactive ticket for doing what was acceptable at the time. That's called presentism. We're going to take what was done back at the time, pull it up into the current time, and condemn you for not knowing what was going to be acceptable 200 years later than when you did it. And I think that is really narcissistic and arrogant and rewriting history instead of letting people learn from the mistakes that were made in America and that we need to learn from so we don't make those mistakes again. We've seen church membership drop below the 50% mark for the first time in our country's history. And I think that that's a problem for a variety of reasons, and one of them being that that's one of the times that families tend to spend quality time together. It's time that they put their phones down. It's time that they usually got together and would go do something as a unit and focus on values that were constructive to the family. There was often meditation time involved. There was often discussions about what was discussed in church that day. They often had Sunday dinner together afterwards and spent quality time like they did no other time during the day. And I think it also is a product of our lessened birth rate, which has dropped because a lot of people join church when they have children because they want their child to be baptized or christened or whatever. And the fact that we've seen our birth rate drop to around 1.6 from 2.1, which is necessary to sustain our infrastructure right now, is a problem. And it seems that that's one of the main reasons that church membership has dropped off. There's fewer kids to go get baptized, christened, or whatever, so people have less reason to go to church, and that's a byproduct of the lesser.
Questions about historical accuracy became one of the most contentious moments of the discussion. Concerns were raised about the danger of rewriting the past and reshaping historical events for political purposes. On its face, That's a principle few people would reject. The real issue, however, is whether that standard is applied consistently. A notable example emerged from Florida's state-approved social studies curriculum in 2023. The standards included language stating that enslaved people developed skills that could later provide personal benefit, a description that sparked widespread criticism and national debate. Because these standards were officially adopted by state authorities, critics argued that the controversy could not simply be dismissed as the work of isolated activists or fringe movements. It raised a broader question about whether concerns over historical revision should be evaluated equally, regardless of which political side is involved. At the same time, another development complicated the public image of accountability. Dr. Phil's media venture, Merit Street Media, entered bankruptcy proceedings while pursuing major legal action against its business partner, Trinity Broadcasting Network. In response, Trinity filed its own lawsuit containing serious allegations regarding the company's management. As the legal battle continued, the bankruptcy ultimately moved into Chapter 7 liquidation, placing control of the remaining assets under a court-appointed trustee. Whether one agrees with either side's legal arguments or not, the timing created an unavoidable contrast. Public discussions about transparency, responsibility, and integrity became more difficult to separate from the challenges unfolding within Dr. Phil's own organization. The conversation eventually shifted to another subject: declining church attendance. Rather than treating it purely as evidence of moral decline, an alternative explanation focused on demographics. Lower birth rates naturally lead to fewer baptisms, fewer young families, and ultimately fewer people filling church pews over time. From that perspective, changing attendance figures may reflect population trends as much as cultural change. Another point involved crime statistics. When declining violent crime rates were introduced alongside falling church attendance, the discussion moved toward different examples instead of directly addressing the comparison. That moment reinforced the larger theme running throughout the exchange. Public figures often encourage others to defend their arguments with evidence, but maintaining that same standard becomes far more difficult when the questions are directed back at them.